Hello, friends and anti-novelists and research-driven writers. I'm coming to you from the library today to talk about research-driven writing and why it is a critical tool to have in your toolkit. I've got a big stack of primary resources, which we'll be talking about, and I've got my Zettelkasten notes ready to go. So let's go top down and talk about research-driven writing. So here we are back on the desk. I just want to give you a high-level overview of what is research-driven writing and how can it serve you. I have found, number one, it makes the writing so much more fun and exciting and interesting when you're doing it. And number two, it gives you such a richer experience to provide for your reader. And let's face it, our readers are our rock stars because without them, we wouldn't have a job. There would be no writing to be done. So let's talk about how to get to it. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about why research-driven writing. Well, first of all, you have to consider, is your story going to have historical elements? If it is, you're going to want to have some level of accuracy around those things. So that's entirely up to you to decide. But make yourself a bullet list at the beginning of the writing project about the kinds of potential historical elements you may want to include. So for example, are you going to include a real place? So my story, largely in part, is set in Guthrie, Oklahoma. So I needed to go back in time and look at the period to see, what does it look like? What was the terrain? What were the politics? What was the government? What did families have or not have? This actually became really important when I get a little further in and talk about services and objects, but we'll put a pin in that. So in terms of setting, think about if you're using elements of history, go back and find out what it was really like so that you can paint that realistic picture for your reader. Second, real events. Okay, if you're going to use actual events as part of your plot, you need to be able to lay those out in such a way that it brings your reader into those events. So what kind of events are you going to use? Again, make yourself a bullet list early on in the story. Are you going to use a state fair? Are you going to use a major political event, like maybe an election? Are you going to use a real jumping off point from, say, an actual crime? Maybe there was a murder, maybe there was a robbery. Those things are going to lead you into a direction, and that's going to help get your story out. If you just choose your setting and start choosing some of those setting elements, those are going to lead to further writing. So if you set your scene in a city, well, what's the city like? Are the streets busy? What are the people doing? How does that city experience its weather? Etc. and so forth. So every decision is going to lead you further down the road of writing your story. Another possibility is real objects. For example, you know that my story centers around the Voynich manuscript. So having an actual object that you're using to inform the details of your story, number one, can be extremely exciting because as a writer, you're actually using an artifact, an object, a place, some real thing as your jumping off point. So just diving into that zone of fascination, thank you, Scott Shepard, and really getting into the weeds and the details of that thing can spur your writing on, especially when you're feeling stuck. So keep that in your back pocket as a bonus. Sometimes doing a little bit of research about some real element of your story can be the thing that spurs you along. A second reason for research-driven writing is to assist with the creativity process. Like I just said, maybe you're doing pre-research to figure out some elements. You're looking at the book Common Poisonous Plants and Mushrooms of North America. Why was this book important? Well, because there is a critical poisoning that takes place in the first few chapters of my book. So I needed to understand absolutely, would that work? How would it work? How much information does my main character know, being a former wildlife biology and botany guy? Those are the things that this helped me to figure out. Additionally, Phyllotaxis. I actually make reference to this bright yellow book in the story because this is a book that my main male character would be very intimately familiar with. So knowing what he knows is critical, and the only way I can do that is to read the book and then take the notes in my Zettelkasten, file them away under that character for safekeeping, and then when I need to do the writing, I pull out my notes and I go through the ideas that I had while I was reading it that are informing what my character knows and what he's thinking. Another idea is world building. If you're doing serious world building, number one, it helps to first sketch out your ideas, then go do that research, whether you're using the internet, you're using books, you're using other combinations of information between primary and secondary resources. All of that research is going to factor in to how you finally end up putting your story together. I've already mentioned setting. One thing that came out of my research, which was quite a cool discovery, is a couple of hours north of Guthrie, Oklahoma, which is the ranch where a chunk of my story is set, there runs the largest black alabaster vein in the United States. There are only 4 of these veins of black alabaster in the world, and one of them happens to be just north of the ranch in my story. How cool is that? Because that figures prominently with another piece of my story. So just doing some reading and finding out that little tidbit gave me just what I needed to plug into another piece and thereby make the story stronger and that much more interesting. So what about your character's vocation and hobby? We already know that my character has a history in botany and wildlife biology. So knowing the things that he studied, especially in regards to how they apply to the Voynich manuscript and the plants that are pictured within it, those are critical pieces. So without research, I could never have figured all of that out for the story. So follow your natural curiosity because it's going to lead you to the things that inform both your story and your characters. Another reason for research-driven writing is to be accurate and thorough, right? You want to verify your ideas so that you can fill in those knowledge gaps. One of the things that I needed to do that with was the autobiography of Christian Dior. He figures prominently in the backstory of one of my bad guys. And so I physically went through and I read his autobiography so that I could really understand the man behind the brand. That was super helpful because I was able to put together historical elements of where was Dior? When was he there? When did he open his fashion house? What did that look like in the beginning and what did it become? Those become the historical frameworks of that fashion brand that allow me to hang my story on them. And when I'm looking at my big timeline that unfolds into a long sheet, I can look at where was he during these years? What was he doing? How did that affect his fashion house? And so on and so forth. Another critical piece for my story was Sheila Payne's Embroidered Textiles. I also make reference to this in the book because there is a section on the magical source of protection and how embroidery is the conduit through which that magic flows. That is a critical piece of my story that I could never have put together without this most excellent book. So that's just another piece of how you're taking something from reality and you're using it to weave that story together. Critical details as they are revealed. Maybe you're revealing a scene, you're revealing critical character details. Maybe it's informing something in your plot. Whatever you're using that research to fill in, you have to have that up front. That's why I encourage you to read into the zones of things that you love, because what that does is you're sharing that fascination, that love of something with your reader and bringing them into it. As a reader, that is extremely fun and satisfying because you can tell, guaranteed, when an author loves something and they're writing and leaning into that love. Super fun. An example out of my items or services discovery is early on in the story, there is a critical revelation that comes by way of a phone call. Well, I had to know because my story is set at the end of the 1800s. Did Guthrie, Oklahoma have phone service during that period? Or it totally would have been an anachronism. I discovered, yes, they did. So I was good to go with using a phone call to reveal that detail. But those are the things you have to think about when you're thinking about, will this work for the story? Finally, I've got Manuscript Studies. Without the Clemens volume of Manuscript Studies, I would never have known what kinds of details and information my main female character knows. She is a provenance researcher and works heavily in the world of manuscripts. So by studying what a manuscript researcher would study and knowing what they know, it tells me the things that she might find funny or joke about. It tells me the critical information that she carries around in her head that informs her work. It tells me the kinds of tangents that she may have gone off on to read about or investigate on her own. All of those things figure prominently into character development. So those are the kinds of reasons why we go down the road of doing actual reality research and then deciding how that's going to inform our story. So as we continue on in this series, we're going to look at each of those pieces from the lens of character, plot, and setting, as well as story development. And we're going to see how those kinds of details can be populated and used, how they can be twisted and faceted together to fill in your story, and how at the end of the day, you can use good research practices in order to make sure that you're getting the best details, the best story, and overall the best book that you can write. So that's where we're headed. I hope you enjoy it. The next video, we will dive right in to research-driven writing. I'll see you over there.